We now have Dr. Nicolas Bonne, who's a vision impaired astronomer and public engagement specialist coming to us from the United Kingdom. Welcome, Dr. Bonne.
Hello, Anna. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so fingers crossed this all works.
Great.
Okay, is that sharing okay with everybody?
Yes, that looks great.
Fantastic. Okay, so once again, thank you so much for having me talk today. It's been an absolutely inspirational day just listening to all the speakers, all the questions that people have been asking. This is such a diverse audience as well. This is just really, really fantastic. So I'm here today to talk to you in particular about the Tactile Universe project, which is something that I lead in the UK. But I'm also going to explain a little bit about myself and how I've ended up where I am, what's inspired me, and how it sort of led to what I'm doing now in terms of research and public engagement. If you want to tweet about any of this, please use Tactile Universe Twitter handle. If you want to tweet about me, please use my Twitter handle, which is coffee_samurai. Okay. So about me. So I identify as he, his, him. I have curly blonde hair, a blonde mustache, and a blonde beard. I have dark brown eyes. And in this particular photo that I have up on the screen, I'm smiling. But that's not actually the me that I want to talk to you about, at least initially. I want to talk to you about me at age 5. So me at age 5, still curly blonde hair, still brown eyes, obviously a lot smaller. And I also had glasses that were about as thick as a soda bottle. So really, really thick glasses. And this was around about the age, so the age of 5, where I decided that I wanted to be an astronomer. And you may think that's pretty young. Maybe I was an ambitious child, I don't know. So I was visually impaired from birth. I was born 3 months premature, and I ended up with an eye condition called retinopathy of prematurity. Now, this is something that isn't quite as common nowadays, but back in the 80s when I was born, it's something that cropped up quite a lot more. It's basically where somebody is born quite premature, their eyes still haven't developed properly. They're put in a humidicrib or a container with oxygen to keep them alive, and that oxygen damages their eyes as their eyes develop. And so that's what happened to me. And so I'm lucky in some respects in that my retinas, the bits at the back of my eyes that receive light, didn't completely detach. So they're still semi-attached, they're damaged, but it does mean that I can see just a little bit as long as I'm really, really, really close to things. And to see my slides right now, to actually talk to you, I've got my head right up against my monitor. Okay, so even though I was visually impaired from birth, I grew up in Australia. And so in a relatively remote, dark part of Australia as well. So even though I couldn't see very much, I was still able to go out at night and experience a little bit of the night sky, see the occasional star, see the moon, or at least where the moon was. Maybe even on a really, really clear night, see the Milky Way stretching across the night sky. And I remember when I was quite young as well, there were lots of documentaries about space on television. And I think the one that I really remember, really particularly remember as being the thing that really got me interested in space, really got me excited about space, was when Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, two space probes that NASA sent out, had started sending back pictures of the planets and moons in our solar system. So pictures of Jupiter and Jupiter's moons, and of Saturn and Saturn's moons, and of Neptune and of Uranus. And I just remember looking at those pictures and being able to tell, even though things were fuzzy and even though my face was right up against the screen, that they were amazing. There was so much detail and so much color, so many things to explore and to wonder about and to try and understand. And so from that age, I really did decide that, yeah, astronomy was what I wanted to do. And again, in some ways I was quite lucky, because growing up, nobody said that I couldn't become an astronomer because of my visual problems, and that I shouldn't do it because it was going to be difficult. And so I never really questioned that ambition, that thing that I wanted to do. And I was lucky, again, that my parents were supportive, my teachers were supportive. Nobody ever said, why are you doing that? They just kind of let me get on with it. Okay, so sometimes not having access to the kinds of resources that would have made things easier for me obviously made things very difficult. So back in the 80s when I was little, there wasn't a lot in the way of stuff that I could actually get my hands on, sort of tactile resources or audio resources to help me learn about space. So I had to make do with what I could access. I may be Dr. Bonne now, but it definitely wasn't an easy road to become to get my PhD. So I actually had to try twice. I quit my first attempt at a PhD because I basically had a breakdown. I had moved to a different city. I didn't build a proper support network. I didn't ask for help. I tried to do everything myself and I was stubborn. I didn't ask for help when I needed it. And I was at that point diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And I'm sure that's something that a lot of people in the audience today can relate to. It's probably something that you have to deal with as well. And you know how profound an impact that can have on your life. It actually took me a good few years after that to start thinking that maybe I wanted to have another shot, that I wanted to try and be an astronomer, even though I'd sort of walked away from that for all of those reasons. And so I went to a different university. I moved closer to home, closer to my family, closer to support networks that I'd established. And I went back in and I tried again. And I got my PhD that second time round. So I managed to get there. This thing that I'd wanted to do since I was 5, I was finally doing. And the work that I did, the research that I did to get my PhD was mostly non-visual. So it was dealing with large databases, lots of numbers, moving those numbers around, trying to match various parameters for objects together so that I could find data trends, so that I could find objects that were really different from all the other objects in my catalogs. But occasionally I did have to double check that my catalogs and their numbers were telling me the right things about the objects that I was studying. And I had to rely on images taken by telescopes. And whenever I had to do that, that was a little bit difficult. Sometimes I'd have to turn to people in my office and say, okay, so this galaxy that I have a picture of on my screen, is it actually blue, or am I just imagining things? Or does it really have spiral arms? Or am I not seeing this picture properly? So there was always that feeling that I couldn't be completely independent, that I had to rely on other people to actually do the research that I wanted to do. Okay. And so this has been said a couple of times today, but I think you'll all agree with this, that astronomy is traditionally a really, really visual science. So the way that it's taught, the way that it's presented to the public, the way that astronomers deal with data and tackle astronomy is usually really, really visual. And this means that people with vision impairments like myself can often find it really, really difficult to engage with topics in the subject. But I would actually make the argument that all astronomers are actually vision impaired people. The reason I say that is because most of the data that we access today, most of those telescope images, are images that it would be impossible to see even if you had perfect vision. They're images taken by telescopes that have been pointing at the sky for hours and hours and hours to collect enough light to actually show those images that we see. They're images that are taken in false color. So they're combinations of images that have just collected blue light and just collected red light and just collected green light. Those images are stacked on top of each other to make the color images that we're so used to seeing in media. And we haven't even talked about images that are taken in wavelengths that the human eye can't even perceive. So images taken in X-ray, in radio wavelengths and ultraviolet. So really when we think about it, even fully sighted astronomers have to do something to augment their vision so that they can actually study the things that they want to study. And so I really want to try and sort of pose the question to you, if that's the case, why can't we go a step further and start thinking more about accessing data using tactile, accessing data using audio? So trying to introduce multi-sensory approaches to data. Because as we've seen, or as we've heard in a lot of the previous talks today, there are so many advantages to moving away from one particular way of accessing data. The more ways you can introduce, the more advantages you offer, the more things you will perceive in one particular mode. Okay, so after I'd finished my PhD, I moved to the UK with my partner, who is now my wife. So she got a job over here and I followed her over. And I had a little bit of downtime while I was looking for work, and I started to think about what kind of things might have made a difference to me when I was growing up and having trouble accessing astronomy, even though it was something that I really, really wanted to learn more about. And these are the kinds of things that I came up with. And again, these are sort of statements and ideas that have been reflected by a lot of the previous talks today. But I feel like it's a good thing to repeat a lot of this stuff because it helps everybody remember. So what we really want to do is build science capital and the aspirations of young VI students from a young age. So science capital is something that some of you may not have come across before. It's a term that's being thrown around in the UK quite a lot at the moment. I really like it though, so I'm going to explain to you what it is. So science capital is the sum of a person's science-related knowledge, their attitudes to science, their experiences relating to science, and the resources that they've collected that are scientific in nature throughout their lives. So this can be everything from how often they go to a museum and see a science exhibit, how often they talk about science with their family or friends. Also, their ability to see themselves or perceive of themselves as scientists. So whether they can relate to scientists as something that they could be themselves. So it's a complicated concept, but it's something that you can tackle really effectively when people are much younger, because their social identity, their idea of what they can access, what they can do, what they can be, isn't anywhere near as concrete as it is much later in life. They haven't had people, usually well-meaning, come up to them and say, oh, you shouldn't do that because it might be difficult, or why are you trying to do that? You can't see, or why do you want to do this really, really audio thing? You can't hear properly. So if we can help people build their confidence at a younger age, it's much more likely that that confidence will carry through, and that sense of self, that sense of ability will carry on to much older ages as well. The other kinds of things that I thought about, the other kinds of things that we can focus on to start trying to sort of improve this, is that we can develop and share multi-sensory resources for learning and research. And we don't only need to share these things, we also need to think about how we can support those resources and make sure that they're understood and usable by the people that we want to use them. We also want to help science communicators everywhere learn how they can accessibilize what they communicate. So help them work out ways to make what they're doing more accessible to everybody. And we also want to demonstrate as much as we possibly can through good practice and also by talking to people that accessibility helps everybody. And so there's that idea of universal design again. So making sure that people realize that even though accessibility may target a particular group of people to start off with, in the long run, it's going to make that thing that you've accessibilized better for absolutely everybody. And it's going to open up new ways of perceiving things. So this is where the idea for the Tactile Universe was born. So the Tactile Universe is a public engagement project which was piloted back in 2016 with some funding from the Southeast Physics Network. It uses mostly at the moment tactile representations of real astronomical data, and it uses that to make topics in current research in astrophysics accessible to the blind and vision impaired community, particularly those younger students that I was talking about before. And so the basic idea that started all of this was, so I was actually speaking to Kate Meredith, who you heard from earlier, and I was talking about these ideas that I'd had. And she sort of said, right, well, you study galaxies. So how could you start communicating galaxies to people with vision impairments? How would you have wanted to access your galaxy images during your PhD? And I came up with an idea. So what I wanted to do was turn a regular black and white image like the one on the left. So this is an image of Messier 51. It's called the Whirlpool Galaxy. It's a spiral galaxy, so it has a big bright bulge in the middle. It has two spiral arms that wrap out sort of around that bulge. And then it has another little galaxy connected to the end of one of those arms. So this is one of my favorite galaxies, but that's an aside. What I wanted to do was make that tactile, but I didn't want to make it single level like Braille. I wanted to make it multi-level. So what I wanted to be able to do was trace that tactile image with my fingers and get exactly the same information that I got if I was to look at that image and be able to see it perfectly. So I wanted to feel all the rises and falls in brightness across that image. So I wanted to map that directly to a tactile image. And one of my colleagues actually overheard my conversation, and he went away, and within a day he came back to me, knocked on my door and said, "Hey Nick, I've got a surprise for you. You know that thing you were talking about yesterday? I've made it for you." And so he'd actually come up with a bit of code that could produce the kinds of images that I described. And so what this does is it takes the brightest or the closest to white image pixel, and it makes that the highest point in the tactile image, so the bit that's raised the most. Then takes the darkest or the closest to black pixel in the image and makes it the lowest point, so the bit that's closest to the background or the base of that model. And then it scales every single shade of gray in between those two. So you really do end up with this beautiful tactile representation of these images. And I really need to emphasize at this point, this isn't just something that I've done. This is something that I've done with the help of a lot of other people. So other people that I've worked with in the department who are still part of the Tactile Universe project. It's not a particularly large group, but we have a nice spread of expertise. So there's myself. I mostly do public engagement nowadays. I don't do so much research, but I'm really enjoying the public engagement. It's something that I'm very happy to be doing mostly. There's also Dr. Jen Gupta. Now, she is the manager of outreach and public engagement in my department at the University of Portsmouth. So she sort of makes sure that all of that side of things is okay. There's Dr. Coleman Kruzek, who is the one who came up with the code to make our images. So he's a technical expert. There's Dr. Cordy Scott, who actually replaced Jen for about 9 months while Jen was pregnant. There's Karen Masters. So Karen is now based at Haverford Uni in Philadelphia. She was at the University of Portsmouth when we started though, and a lot of our work was based on the research that she did into galaxies and the work she did with a project called Galaxy Zoo. And there's also Laura Nuttall, Dr. Laura Nuttall. She's one of our newest additions, and she studies gravitational waves. And I'm going to talk about the input that she's going to have at the very end of this presentation. But just to emphasize that this is very much a team effort. Okay. So as I said, we started off in 2016. Obviously, I had ideas about what I wanted, what would work for me as a vision impaired person. But as a lot of you would know, and as has been discussed in previous talks today, every disability, and vision impairment is no exception, every individual has very individual needs and very individual ways of dealing with their disability. So what would work for me would not necessarily work for anyone else with a vision impairment. So during our pilot project, we tested a lot of things with our local VI community. We went out with lots of different sized models, with lots of models that had different heights. So more prominent tactile features or less prominent tactile features. We played around with all different kinds of aspects of these models, and we asked as many different people with as many different vision impairments for all of their feedback so that we could improve our models and make them as versatile as we possibly could. And I've actually got the final, so 2 pictures here of the final products of our models. If I just jump backwards for a second, so the model that I'm showing on this particular slide is really simple. The tactile features aren't very high. It's basically just a flat slab of plastic. The final model is really, really different. So the final model is a lot thinner. The tactile features are more pronounced, so they're easier to feel. The model's around about the size of a postcard, and it has raised edges all the way around the edge. These models, so on the right-hand side, I've got another example of some of our older models. On the top, I have one of our tactile images, and then on the bottom, I have that image flipped over. And so on the back, we've actually attached the original image that was used to make the tactile image, and we've mirrored it. And so what this allows for is for anybody to use this image in whatever way they want to. They can either just feel one side and just use the tactile. They can flip the model over and just look at the image and take things in visually if that's what suits them. They can also look at the image on one side and feel exactly what they're seeing on the other side. So they can use whatever combination of visual and tactile they want to. And this made us realize very early on that these models were going to be really helpful for everybody, not just people with vision impairments. Some of the other features that came out of testing with vision impaired people is that raised edge that I was talking about. So the raised edge around the outside is actually a way for people to identify the highest possible point of the tactile features. So that raised edge will always be as high as the highest point. If you bridge your hand from that edge to the tactile features, you can always work out how high up you are, how bright that bit of the image you're feeling is. Yeah, so lots of different features. The models wouldn't be anywhere near as great as they are today if we hadn't have gotten all of that amazing feedback from the local vision impaired community in Portsmouth. And we continue to do that today. Everything new we develop, we always talk to as many people as we can. We get as many points of view and we try to make everything as versatile as possible. Okay. So beyond testing, we decided to start focusing on engagement with schools. And we wanted to engage with schools for all of those reasons that I talked about at the start, because we really wanted to inspire people at a young age to get vision impaired students thinking about what they were capable of, what they could access if they really, really wanted to, and if they had the tools that they needed. So with funding from the Science and Technology Facilities Council, and something called the Nucleus Award, we developed these versatile tactile resources. We also developed workshops for upper primary school and lower secondary school age students. So covering everything from the solar system to galaxies and building up all these concepts from basically the ground up. So dealing with what we can see from the Earth, what our solar system's like, where our solar system sits inside our galaxy, the Milky Way, how our galaxy compares to other galaxies, and how galaxies populate the universe. So building up from simple concepts to more complicated concepts. And along with those models and those lesson plans, we also provided a whole lot of supporting documentation, because as I said at the start, we can't just develop resources and expect people to understand them. We wanted to make sure that we gave people all of the additional information they needed to go away and use these resources on their own, or for teachers to use these in classroom settings for their students. And we developed all of this so that it would work. Probably the best setting for most of the workshops we developed are for mainstream classrooms. So classrooms with a few VI pupils, mostly sighted pupils. The advantage here is that everybody can work together using exactly the same resources. Everybody will get something slightly different out of them, but that sense of working together, using the same things, not singling anyone out as being different, is actually really powerful. And it does a lot for helping I guess sighted and non-sighted people socialize, sort of break down those barriers. People might feel awkward talking to each other, but doing activities like this can really help people start to communicate, to understand each other. Okay, here I've got two pictures of some of the schools workshops and schools testing that we did. On the left-hand side, I have an image of my co-worker Jen, and she is describing one of our models to a totally blind student who gave us some of the really good feedback that we used to make the models better. On the right-hand side, I've got an image of me talking to some more of the students that we did tests with. One of them, I believe, is asking me a question about the model that they're holding, and I'm trying to describe the physical feature. So what's actually physically causing that tactile feature in that galaxy image? So they ask some really good questions. They help us work out the kinds of things we needed to explain to make those models more understandable. Okay. So as well as doing all of this, I did talk about one of the ways that we can start to improve accessibility, obviously, is to share our ideas. So if there are only a small number of people trying to make things more accessible, nothing is ever going to move forwards. So as part of our work, we've also been doing a lot of consultancy and collaboration with other projects. And this has involved projects both in the UK and internationally. So we've been working with science centres and various exhibits to produce accessible activities and things that people can basically come along and interact with in different ways from what they would probably be used to. It's also good if there are vision impaired visitors, they'll have something that's a little bit more accessible than the average sort of science centre. We've also been advising and resource sharing with groups like iData, so the project that Kate Meredith spoke about earlier on in the day, as well as Astro BVI, which is a project in South America, and the British Science Festival. And we've also been invited to do a lot of talks on accessibility and science communication and how those two can be brought together. So that's been a lot of fun. And we think we are starting to get the message out there that this kind of thing is important, that it's not as difficult as people think, and that we're there to support people if this is something that they're interested in. So just as an example of some of that collaboration, I've got a picture here of a model It's about 1.7 meters by 0.4 meters. It's a tactile version of the Milky Way as seen from Earth. And this is sitting in a museum up in Newcastle, which is in the north of England. So completely the opposite end of the country from where I am right now. But they wanted to make their museum space more accessible. And so we helped them do that. And apparently this model has been really, really successful. I should add, this has also been designed with wheelchair access in mind. They made their table a very particular height, and they also sloped the model that they put it on a slope rather, so that it was easy to reach if you were sitting in a wheelchair. So they've really been putting a lot of thought into how to do this. Some of the kinds of talks and meetings that we've been running. On the left-hand side, I've got a picture of a training workshop that we ran at the Communicating Astronomy to the Public conference in Japan back in 2018. Here we're basically using our models as a way of getting people to think about what kind of language they're using to describe galaxies and images, and what kind of language they can use to describe those things in more accessible ways, especially if they have a tool like the ones we've created in their hands at the same time. And on the right-hand side is a really inaccessible presentation that I like to give that teaches people about how to give more visually accessible presentations. And so you can actually only, even if you've got perfect vision, you can probably only see about half of the slide that's up there on the right-hand side, because I've deliberately made it very difficult to see. Okay. One of the other things we've done is we've also started to play around with the idea of sonification. So obviously there are a lot of groups doing really wonderful sonifications of data. We wanted to see how effectively we could combine sonification with tactile images. So at the British Science Festival, I collaborated with an astronomer from the European Southern Observatory. We put together a show that was basically a journey from the surface of the Earth all the way to the edge of the universe through a number of different astronomical objects. We made tactile images of all of those, and my collaborator Chris produced a whole lot of sonifications of those data as well. So things like the sound that the stars would make as they appear in the night sky as the sun goes down and the light disappears, or the surround sound that galaxies would make as they collide with one another in the darkness of space. And the image that I have here has all the different models that we made. There's everything from the cosmic microwave background, which is basically the heat that we can pick up from the birth of the universe. And we see this as a, it's usually presented as a multicolored map with lots of little segments that are all sort of the same size. These segments usually represent differences in temperature, but we can make that this beautiful sort of bumpy map, and you can feel that all those bumps are roughly the same size. And that tells us a lot about how the universe was made. We also produced galaxy images, images of the surface of the sun, tactile image of the black hole image that was taken last year. All different kinds of weird and wonderful things. And what we actually got there, because we had so many sighted attendees, we actually got people to put blindfolds on. We got them to experience the show with no vision, just using their ears and just using their fingertips. And I think for a lot of people, that was a really weird and wonderful way of doing it. But they also sort of, the feedback at the end was very much the people had experienced things in a way that they didn't think they'd be able to, but that they'd also felt things that they didn't think they would have been able to see. So there again is that example that giving people different ways of accessing things can be really powerful. Okay. So I also talked about training science communicators. So just lastly, I'd like to talk about our plans currently for building a national network of people who will present science to the vision impaired community in the UK. So back in 2019, we ran 5 presenter training workshops in various locations around the UK, and they were attended by 66 science communicators. So these were people who worked in universities, they were vision impaired members of the public, they were people who work for science museums, they were teachers, they were people from all over the place. But they were people who thought this would be interesting, who wanted to learn more about communicating science to the vision impaired community, and people who wanted to learn more about the resources that we'd put together. So we spent a day basically making those people feel more comfortable with the idea of talking to vision impaired people, helping them realize that there's nothing to be scared of, that nothing they say could really be offensive unless they actually really wanted to be offensive, which none of them did, which is good. But also showing them how effective resources like the ones we can be, paired with the kinds of language that we use to talk about science can really, really help not only vision impaired people, but everybody. While we were running those workshops, we also produced 20 resource kits, which we sent out to 20 groups of those people that we trained so that they could deliver our resources to their local areas. And so now those resources dotted all over the UK, all the way sort of from the bottom to the top of England into Scotland as well. I think we even have one kit in Wales. We don't have any in Ireland just yet, but we do hope to run some workshops in Ireland in the future. We've also made our resources available online so that anybody can download them, can 3D print them, and can basically access them in any way they want to. We have had some groups internationally use them. Karen has started to try to engage the local VI community in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, with the Tactile Universe resources. We also have a group from the University of Toronto in Canada who've downloaded our resources and are using them in some of their stargazing evenings. Okay. So what I've got a picture of here is one of our workshops. So the picture here is a lot of people crowded around an old wooden table. In the background, there are lots and lots of bookcases. So this is actually in the meeting room at the Royal Astronomical Society in London. The person sitting closest to the front of the image is actually a blind artist. So she wanted to see how these kinds of images could possibly apply to theatre or art installations, but she was also really interested in learning about astronomy because it was something that she'd always wanted to learn more about, but hadn't really been able to. And so we've captured a moment where everybody's talking to each other about the models. We haven't really explained what the models are. We've just given them the models and we've asked them to discuss them, what they feel, what they perceive, what they see, and sort of come up with ideas on their own. And just after we took this picture, we actually started to explain what the models were, put everything into context. But we really wanted to get everyone to feel those models first and start thinking about them without any additional information from us. I've got some more pictures here. So the left-hand image shows 160 of the 400 tactile galaxy images that we produced for those kits that I mentioned. We used liquid resin to actually make these models. That's not something we do anymore because it turns out it's a really silly way of making models. If they fall off a table, they break straight away. So we've gone back to 3D printing. 3D printing is much, much better. On the right-hand side, I have a stack of the boxes that contain all of the kit resources. They're being loaded into a van so that my colleague Cordy could drive them all the way across the UK to deliver them to the various people who we decided to give these resources to. And so our plans moving forward for this network are we want to hold regular virtual meetings because we're scattered all over the UK. Obviously, doing everything in person isn't really practical. Obviously, with the current situation, doing everything virtually is also a much, much better idea. We also want to have drop-in sessions. We basically want to make sure that everybody working with our resources has contact with each other, but also can access us whenever they need to, if they have questions or experiences that they've had that they want to talk about because they think they might help us or others. We also want to provide shared evaluation frameworks so that everybody can collect the same data. We can put all that data together and use it to basically evolve the project and make it better over time. We want to develop shared and evolving FAQs, so frequently asked questions, documents, as well as best practice documents that can basically be shared and updated by everybody who's part of this network so that they can add their own experiences, what they found to work, what they found doesn't work. So we want this to be something that everybody inputs in, everybody feels like they're building. And just finally, moving forward with this, in the next 2 years, we're aiming to develop multisensory approaches to engaging upper secondary school students with vision impairments with gravitational wave science. So that's where Laura comes in. She's going to advise us on the scientific side of things, make sure the science we're communicating is correct, but also, yeah, help us develop those resources. So we want to do stuff with sound, we want to do stuff with visual, we want to do stuff with audio, we want to bring, and tactile, sorry, we want to bring everything together. We're then going to train gravitational wave research groups around the UK to deliver these resources from where they're based. And we're going to expand the reach and the membership of this presenter network that I've been talking about. And so just finally, if you want to contact us, you can get in touch via tactileuniverse@gmail.com. And of course, I'm going to share these slides with all of you, so you'll be able to get this information. You can also find out more about our project at www.tactileuniverse.org. That's also where our resources are shared. And you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook by looking for @Tactile Universe. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Bonne. That was fascinating. Thank you. We do have a number of questions for you. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time to get to them all. But what I will say to folks is, like Julia and like Amanda and like Sarmista, Dr. Bonne has offered to host one of our social chats, which will take place after the keynote address. So if you have questions, I encourage you to hold them for him until then. And as he mentioned, I'll be sure to share his slides. A quick note for you in the comments. One person is also wondering if you could share the inaccessible presentation as well that you mentioned, so they could have a kind of a reference point.
Sure, I can definitely do that. Another option for that, so most of that presentation was inspired by the, I think it's the International Blind Union, the PowerPoint presentation guides that they have, but I'll also make all of those links available as well.
Fantastic. And then another question here from Adrian in the chat, who asks, is the algorithm/program used for creating your 3D models available for working with other images?
Absolutely. So we've actually made that code as easy to use as possible. All you need is to install a 3D modeling bit of software called Blender. That's free. You don't need to pay to use it. We've got all the instructions for installing the plugin that my colleague's written. All you then need to do is, it's 5 or 6 steps, things you need to click on to basically use any black and white image, or any color image actually, you can turn into a tactile image exactly the same way we've turned our galaxy images into tactile images. So that code will take anything, take any black and white image. And yeah, all the instructions for doing that are also up on the website. So we want people to use that in all kinds of weird and wonderful ways that we haven't thought of.
Amazing, thank you. And I see some folks who asking in the presentation slides you send me if you can add any of your sound files or links to the sonification. Some folks are interested in listening to some of those files that you mentioned.
Absolutely. So I'll have to ask my colleague Chris for permission to do that, because those files technically belong to him, but I'm sure he won't have a problem with that. So I'll see whether I can share those with you as well. Great,
thank you. And I'm just looking through the Q&A here. Give me one moment here. Yes, I think that covers most of the quick things we can go over. All the rest are a little bit more detailed questions, so we'll go ahead and save those for the chat. If you did have a question that we didn't get to answer for Dr. Bonne, please join his social chat. One thing I will mention too is that you're actually able to move between the rooms. So that's why at the end of today's conference, I will reshare all 4 links, and you can decide when to go in and out of each room. So if you have a question for all 4 of our hosts, you can make that happen by moving between the rooms. So thank you so much, Nick. That was fantastic. And we really appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.